Welcome to the Strive, Seek, Find podcast with me, Tom Heaton. I recently published my book summary on the excellent Blueprint by Robert Plomin. If you'd like to read that, you can find that on my Substack page at striveseekfind.substack.com. But I'll try and summarise some of it here. It is a thorough and engaging review of his research into the impact of our genes on our lives, but it raised some very deep and important questions about many of the themes that I'm interested in here: learning, health and philosophy. As such, I wanted to reflect a bit more on some of the lessons that we could take from this. Some of the key parts of his research can probably be summarised as such. 1. Almost every personal trait arises from a mixture of genetic and environmental contributions. 2. Genes and environmental factors interact in multiple complex ways, termed the nature of nurture. 3. The genetic component is often much bigger than we realise, especially when it comes to our psychological domains. And 4. These are polygenic and pleiotropic. That is, traits arise from multiple different genes, and single genes have effects on multiple different traits. These findings raised some quite challenging conclusions. I found it especially interesting to try and balance with much of my own reading around education and learning, for example. The lessons from Peak by Erickson and Poole are a good example of this, highlighting our incredible ability to grow and develop. As such, there appear to be two themes that might, at first glance, be in competition with each other: genetic determinism and neuroplasticity. The genetic determinism argument is a concern that might be inferred from some of the evidence outlined in Blueprint. This is despite the analysis that Plomin himself gives, trying to highlight the associated nuance of genetic influence and disavowing any claims towards determinism. However, there is still a lingering shadow. If our genes have such an impact on the type of person that we become, our personality and even our educational achievement, then what can we do about it? And even if we can make a change, are we doomed to inexorably return to our predetermined set point? Just such a case has been well argued for aspects such as individual happiness. There is a risk of becoming somewhat fatalistic about these questions. However, to me, there seem to be two strong marks against a deterministic argument here: probability and causality. Firstly, we have to understand how the science is done here. As Plomin well describes, the magnitude of single gene genetic influence is so small that they need very large sample sizes to detect and correlate the relevant changes. We are not talking about much lower number of cases where gene problems cause major changes, such as disease states. That is, these are not analysed on an individual level, but across huge numbers of individuals. This makes any genetic impact probabilistic, inferred from its effect across many people. What does it mean if I have gene X? Well, it probably doesn't mean anything, but it shifts the chances of trait A being more positive, especially if you also have genes Y and Z, etc. This can be well seen even in the domains most highly impacted by genetics. None of these traits have close to 100% heritability. This leads nicely onto the fact that none of this describes a causal process. All of the research is descriptive, albeit with some of the powerful inferences that twin studies give. That is, if only one variable remains, it is suggestive that this is the variable that is having the effect. As such, this research provides good evidence of an association between these genes and outcomes, but how does the effect happen? Plomin notes the fascinating interactions between genes and environment that further complicate such an analysis, the nature of nurture as he calls it. Genes change how we interact with our environment, and our environment may then affect our genes' expression. I think smoking is a useful example because of its strongly physical nature. Is smoking propensity genetic or environmental? Well, we wouldn't smoke if there were no cigarettes in our environment, but there is a genetic predilection to such an activity. Some people are probabilistically more likely to start smoking, more likely to continue smoking, and more likely to get negative health outcomes from it. Our genes don't make us smoke, but they contribute. Our environment doesn't make us smoke, but it contributes. This links closely with what we know about education. That is, we have an incredible ability to remodel our brains, termed neuroplasticity. In health, this allows for the development of incredible skills, surpassing what older generations of humanity thought was even possible. In severe neurological disease, it even allows parts of the brain to substitute in for other parts. This has been the focus of a number of books I have covered on my Substack page. The aforementioned Peak by Erickson and Poole, Grit by Angela Duckworth, and Mindset by Carol Dweck. Learning is clearly environmental, but what determines how we learn? Anyone who has sat in the school classroom will know that some pupils are not learning anything because they are paying absolutely no attention to the lesson. Is a genetic predisposition to focus an educational advantage? Where does the motivation for the effort of hard learning come from? Genes, upbringing, or our culture? I have many questions still unanswered, as does the field as a whole. However, I think some points do come through. Firstly, almost every domain is a summation of both genes and environment. It is very clearly nature and nurture, not or. Secondly, we seem uniquely positioned within the animal world to consciously and logically adjust our environment. It is this factor that makes all the difference. Yes, there is a genetic influence, but we have control over what is left. And the nature of nurture means that, as we learn more, we're continuing to make an impact upon the genetic component too. As such, there seems nothing deterministic about genetics of the sort that we are discussing here. When it comes to our brains, we just seem too plastic. And what is more, we can be self-aware of this plasticity. The genes simply begin to provide us with some general starting points, and potentially some upper limits as well. The research diplomat is not looking at our attempts to push these boundaries. It is much more observational, describing what is and not what could be. The work that does study us exerting our influence, such as that of Erickson, Duckworth and Dweck, shows a positive impact. There is still much to be explored here, but to my mind, our plasticity beats our genes every time. Our genes will wield a great amount of power, especially if we are not mindful about our own potential influence. But when we do exert our influence, the results are significant. I find this an empowering thought. Thank you for listening. To keep up to date and to follow my writings, subscribe to me on Substack, which is striveseekfind.substack.com, or follow me on X at 2striveseekfind.